Today we've got Vlad joining us. He's giving us a talk on CTO's Playbook, sharing some opinions and some experiences of his own on what he thinks makes great technology products. We're going to try a slightly different format today, rather than a typical presentation holding questions until the end. We're going to encourage people to join in throughout. So Vlad split his talk up into 7 different topics. He's going to share some anecdotes, some thoughts, some experience on each topic, and then invite everyone to share their own experiences, their own thoughts, ask any questions, and then we'll move on to the next topic. So if you want to share anything, you want to ask anything, use the raise hand button. I will call your name out, and then yeah, fire away. But yeah, don't just jump in. It might be a bit of a free for all then. So yeah, try and drop me a message or use the raise hand feature. And yeah, apologies in advance if there's too many raised hands or too many questions, we don't get around to all of you, but there might be some more time at the end, so we'll see how it goes. But yeah, over to you, Vlad.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. The title of this session is called The CTO's Playbook for Building Great Technology Products, which can be a bit of a mouthful. Before I get into that, I'll just spend a minute talking about myself. I've been building wide-reaching systems, mainly in content delivery, cloud computing and storage, cybersecurity, and telecoms for nearly 20 years. I started as a systems and network engineer in a time when everything was built in-house, so that meant also writing the software, and then transitioned fairly quickly into writing software, then called all the stops through architecture, leadership, and management to CTO roles. I now work as a consulting CTO on behalf of 101 Ways, which is a consultancy based in London. They're a boutique sort of product and technology firm working a number of different verticals than my previous ones. I also act as a technology consultant for a private equity due diligence firm called Intuitus Advisory. And from those 2 roles that I've been oscillating between in the past couple of years, I've been able to observe a fair number of anti-patterns in technology organizations, which made me better realize my own mistakes from the past. So today, I'd like to share with you what really is a personal checklist for what I think makes us as technologists build better products. This is a compilation of my learnings from my own mistakes and as well as others. So starting from this principle, we often hear this, that engineering is all about building the thing right, and product management is about building the right thing. Now, the more time I spend in the industry, these 2 concerns have pretty much combined into one. Even in earlier leadership roles, there's a lot of business context that you get exposed to, and the decisions you make are not strictly technical, they're always technical in a wider context. So in other words, you're not looking for perfection, but you're looking for perfection in a specific frame of reference. So going back to those mistakes and others have made, I do believe that our mission is to serve the business and the product as an extension of that. So how apt we are at figuring out if we are building the right thing is equally important as building it the right way. So I'll go through that list of topics that I wanted to discuss one by one and share some thoughts and anecdotes. And as Matt said, please feel free to chime in and ask more, or if you have a different story, I'd be really keen on hearing about it. I myself come from a very PaaS, SaaS, and IaaS heavy background. So some of these points I'm going to make today are going to be fairly specific to those kinds of products where the audience of the products are also technologists. But most of them should apply to pretty much anything we build using technology. So the first point I want to try and make is about how we as leaders enter the equation. I have myself been in that position, and I have worked with people who have been in the same position where they've joined a company as CTO or VP of engineering, and the remit laid out for them had somewhat been set in stone, and their performance from that moment onwards was going to be judged over a course that had already been plotted. In other words, they insert the equation in a role that was not necessarily, that didn't necessarily make them partners to the leadership team, the board of the company, but servants of that, and their only role was to implement the mission that and the path that was already charted. I myself tend to be a little bit reserved when it comes to that. So if we imagine a Maslow pyramid where you have the business strategy at the very bottom, which drives everything else, and then you have your product strategy, which serves business strategy, and on top of that we have the technology strategy. I myself have made this mistake. I've been in interviews for leadership roles where it didn't even occur to me to ask about the business and product strategies. The only focus of the conversation was on the technology strategy, and my initial assumption was that everything else was fine and worked within that artificial boundary, which should not have happened. Now, years later, I always go into these conversations asking a lot about the business and how they approach product management, where they want to go in 6 months, in 3 years, and in 5 years, because that is going to change the tone of that technology piece of that conversation. And how people react when you ask tough questions from their domain can tell you a lot about those roles. In effect, it's perfectly equitable to ask those tough questions that don't have to do with strategy, because in return, they'll expect the same of you. They would want to know everything about you as a technologist. So to be on an even keel, that conversation has to be somewhat proportionate that way. Also, another thing that I like to keep in mind when entering these conversations is that there might be an XY problem hidden in there. The XY problem, not sure if you're familiar with the concept, is when someone has a problem, X, and they think that to solve X, they must first solve problem Y. So they approach you with a request for help with problem Y. And then you spend time and money trying to solve the Y problem without having any context over the X problem. Sometimes companies do know what they don't know, sometimes they don't, and the interviewing process needs to try and cover that. I have some examples of such prescriptive situations where a technical leader is asked to come in and accomplish a mission. One that I've come across quite often has been one where, for instance, the company said, we have a technology organization of 60 people. It's April. We want to be 100 engineers and product managers by December. That always is an interesting conversation to have. Thinking about this logically, if the problem in hand is highly complex, then it's bound to become, you're bound to discover more more unknowns along the way. And having made that determination that you need exactly 100 people at that stage is always interesting. Might be 100, might be 120, might be 70, who knows. If on the other hand, the problem at hand is trivial, it almost sounds like they're trying to throw more bodies at the problem, in which case there might be a smarter way of solving that problem rather than with hiring more people. All in all, if we do care about the success of the product, believe we need to ask those potentially uncomfortable questions as we join companies as CTOs and VPs of engineering, to make sure that we have our remit allows us to drive change if change is required. Otherwise, we end up effectively scaling up trouble. So that's been point one. I'm happy to take any feedback for that before I move forward. Okay.
We've got one question from Liviu, actually.
Okay.
Hi there, thanks for the presentation, Vlad. So the quick question would be about how do you deal with capacity management, map that towards successful product? So you mentioned companies wanted to increase in size, and that may be a function of capacity management of sorts. And then you could potentially imagine that all 150 people work on the same product. It's more with products to perhaps more products, that work together. But if you deal with, 150 people working on different products, how do you map the, products and capacity planning for that? Thanks.
Sure. I actually have a separate topic for this later on, which has to do with encouraging product managers to work together to identify commonalities between their respective product lines. And ideally, you'd want to take a platform-first approach to product development, where if you have shared functionality between those products, you only develop it once, as it were, and then you share that across your products. That requires a fairly lengthy conversation at the beginning about the product strategy, having a broad look at the technology stack, the market fit, to try and understand those pressure points. All of which can, of course, turn that interviewing process when you join a company as CTO into a fairly long one. Now, sometimes companies are open to doing that. But failing that, there's always that probation period that I believe works both ways. I think it's risky to think that after week one how many people you need. And as long as the company is willing to accept correction to their original plan from you, that's fine. So I'm not sure if that's answered the question. I wish there was a black and white answer to your question on day one.
All right, thanks.
Okay. My next point is about how we shape our hiring policy. I strongly believe in hiring missionaries rather than mercenaries. And what that means is preferring people who align with the values of your business and mission of your product, people who are team players who like problem solving in general, rather than people who thrive on very specific tools like this or that programming language or framework, or people whose comfort zone is very narrow. In other words, I find this a lot since I've started consulting. There have been a couple of cases where retooling, rebuilding a product. In some cases, that's required. That there's no way around it. That needed effectively passing that product to another team, a whole different team that did not exist. So now you have two problems. You have to restack the product and build a team to do it with. On the other hand, if your original team was amenable to change and they just saw the challenge in building the product right as a sum of reasonable technical compromises, which could mean using different tools for different purposes, that would have been a lot simpler. In many companies I work with that are not set up like that already, the advice for them is to start with team leads, bringing in team leads who work that way, and product managers whose mission, among other things, would be to spread the gospel and continue to raise the bar for hiring. That is not to say that you don't want a Java specialist or, a PostgreSQL specialist. You do, but as long as their skills and affinities are not terribly specific. A polar opposite of that would be, for instance, cases when, for a very good reason, you can't afford switching to the latest and greatest technology. Maybe there's simply not enough scrutiny over a new library you want to use, and you work in a very security sensitive environment. That in itself is an engineering challenge, and people who appreciate engineering challenges in general will make the best out of that rather than getting frustrated. That went quickly. So if anyone has, I'm very interested in opinions that are different from mine rather than people just saying, yep.
Yeah, I think, Will Britton, have you got a question?
Yeah, I did actually. It was about the last slide. So I don't mind waiting until the end or whatever. Should I just shoot now?
Yeah, please. Well, I spent less time than I thought, so we have plenty of time.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, I mean, it was about. I really like the pyramid thing with business strategy, product strategy, and tech strategy, and just from my own experience, it's really important to have that conversation about, especially product strategy, because it underlies everything. But I suppose I've seen a divide in how people think about, in particular, the CTO role, whether that actually covers responsibility for product or not. My own opinion is that it should, and it works better that way. But I wondered what your thoughts were.
I'm very much on the same page, and at least in the type of products that I've been building, that hasn't been a nice to have, but a must rather. I actually have a point about that two slides from now.
Okay, great.
I agree with you, and yes, most companies. Actually, this is a good segue into the next slide, which has to do with how we build teams to deliver technology products. I'm sure a lot of people on the call today are or have been in companies where the product and engineering functions have been completely separate from the beginning, and effectively that's a case of writing a wish list and throwing over a fence and hoping for the best, and then it doesn't take long before it turns into a he said she said type situation, where everyone's trying to pass the hot potato rather than share the responsibility and the success. So my next point is about how we build product teams. And I've narrowed it down to a few things. The first one is empower, and what that means to me is allowing them to establish their own product vision, OKRs, strategy and priorities, to achieve the business goals, working their way bottom up from an initial set of very high level requirements. In most traditional organizations, the ideation happens either at the top in the boardroom, or somewhere between sales and marketing, which sometimes works fine. But if you develop a complex technology product, those are not the best places for innovation. The best places for innovation are within the product teams. Now, if you tell them this is a problem, this is an outcome we need to get to, and here's how you need to get to that outcome, that creativity element is completely stifled, which almost always creates space for more mercenaries to come, because it drives the missionaries away. They're effectively only allowed to manifest 50% of who they are professionally. In terms of skills, oh, sorry, I skipped one. Healthy. That to me has several meanings. Probably the most important one is that every person on the team is on an equal footing. They are all equal, and they all are responsible for those outcomes. In many traditional organizations, there's almost a caste system where you have the leadership team and maybe sales at the top, and then you have the product function as a servant of that, or a very thin layer between that and engineering. And then you have engineering, who are a servant to product, and then maybe you have QA, which in many organizations is another separate entity, which is a servant to engineering, and that's not a very healthy relationship to have. In terms of skills, we talk about product teams. Yes, you need at least one of everything in those teams so they can be self-sustained. T-shaped effectively means everyone has a common core of skills and knowledge that they can use to relate to one another, and their different areas of specialization ensures that they can solve tough problems. They have all the knowledge within the team to do that, and also there's a lot of knowledge that they can share with each other and learn, which helps a lot, I found, with retaining people, especially the missionary type. Also to do with the health, I've skipped one very important aspect. I myself have been in companies where these different disciplines were geographically separate. The leadership and sales organizations were on one continent, product on a second continent, engineering on a third continent. With all the goodwill in the world, someone's going to take a hit on their personal life, trying to make it up to either to very early or very late conference calls. We see this now in the current state of affairs as well. If communication was easy, we wouldn't have as much theory about the verbal and non-verbal communication and how that helps and how it is hard. So in my experience so far, I've had the most success when cross-functional product teams were all based in the same geography, either in the same office or at least in the same time zone to have similar cycles. This goes back to several conversations I've been having lately about how to grow a team geographically, how to set up a new office in another country. If you're ready to give them that power and allow them to do the product development bottom up from that region, fine. If not, you might want to revisit that. And if we are CTOs who do have product underneath us, that's something we should flag right away as the company is looking to grow. That's what I had for this topic. So if anyone wants to add or
Yeah, thanks, Christoph. Sorry, thanks, Vlad. Christoph made a point that probably spans across this slide and the last slide. It's about hiring. Obviously, unless you have a huge network of your own and you know lots of technologists that've got varied skills, you'll inevitably have to use recruiters, whether that's an internal team or an agency. How do you get that across to them when, and I can probably throw my 2 cents in at this as well, but how do you get that across to talent partners that you want a varied skill set and not just keywords? Because I know a lot of recruiters do just want keyword skill sets and box ticking.
of course. Ever since my first leadership role, I've been in touch with maybe a handful of recruiters and headhunters who by now know how I operate. And it's like every evolving relationship. It's nearly like training your spam filter, effectively getting them to understand what is noise and what is signal for you when they bring candidates to your attention. So to date, I have maybe 6 or 7 people I always work with. They've worked with several recruitment agencies in their career, but my relationship is with them rather than the agencies, if that makes sense. And yes, they might only send me 2 CVs a month, but they will always be relevant. And developing that relationship with them has taken time, but it absolutely pays off.
Yeah, perfect. And I think Gajendra, you disagreed with something he said. Do you want to throw your hat in there?
Yeah, sure. I think I kind of disagree with the fact that the product management should be under the CTO as the CTO, the technology domain. The key thing is the responsibilities of a product management or a product manager to a technologist are completely different. So it comes down to the accountabilities and responsibilities. It is not about what you know and what you don't know and how good you are. In an enterprise, you would hire people to actually deliver some with responsibilities and accountabilities. And of course, the product managers are thinking about developing a product which makes enterprise the business and what they stand for. And yeah, product manager may not be necessarily have that skills or SMEs into some factor or for the things which they need, and that's why they as an enterprise it draws on to different skill sets from a different verticals they have. That does not necessarily mean that because you as 80% you're drawing onto the CTO domain means that the product management has to be within the within a CTO domain, unless you are actually taking over the responsibility and accountabilities of a project management. Because the mindset and the thought process of a product management is completely different to into what you're thinking from a technologist point of view, where you are actually underpinning the infrastructure, underpinning the capabilities which will draw your product. So I think there is a draw line, and it always should be a draw line. Yes, it grays out based on how much the technology is involved actually building your technology, but that's not means that the guy who's a programmer who is basically doing a lot of Java coding into that app does not mean that he should be also a product manager of that, because that thought process does not need that. So that's just my two cents on that.
I think it speaks a lot to the many kinds of products a company can build. And there are, I can think of products where I absolutely agree with you and products where I don't, or there's some sort of fine line in between. As I said, my disclaimer in the beginning of the conversation was this was going to be about building products that are consumed and used by other technologists. So in that kind of arrangement, if your product manager cannot think like an engineer, you're probably a step or two behind. So I'm going to delve into that a little bit in my next slide, especially which I think is very relevant for companies that are not set up like that, where product and engineering are under the same umbrella, but they're different entities. And I'll start with listing what I think a product manager should have as qualities. So they have knowledge, customer, industry and domain knowledge, technology, user experience, business and financial. So there's a lot of context they have that, as you said, the average person solving day-to-day engineering problems is not particularly concerned with. They also have process skills dealing with customer discovery, product discovery, development, and product optimization. They have individual skills, team collaboration, time management, stakeholder and community management. And as you said, well pointed out, most people in engineering don't realize that. So for them, the job and the activities of a product manager can be a bit of an opaque thing. And if you try and set up a team that is tasked with outcomes rather than output, you will soon find that there's a communication problem between those two disciplines who don't really understand each other that much, or don't care for each other that much. What has worked for me, both in my permanent roles where I was building the platforms and the services, and as well as since I have started consulting, has been to encourage product management and engineering to engage more, by both involving engineers in the hiring process of product managers and involving product managers in the process of hiring engineers. Ultimately, if you're going to learn how the other person thinks, might as well start on day one or before that. But I do think that if your product is targeting a very technical audience, then your product managers should be very tech savvy. They need to be able to think like the users they're trying to build a product.
Yeah, sure. I agree with that, because yes, you're right. So the product manager is basically has his own skill into what field they are developing the product. So, but I think the question is whether that product manager, who is even a tech savvy or even actually have been a system engineer or a programmer, not necessarily mean that it is he need to be part of the CTO domain or verticals. That's what I'm talking about. So it's all, we're talking about the divisions and the responsibility as the vertical. I agree totally. Yes. Yeah.
Some companies prefer to do that simply because it's easier, because for various historical or cultural reasons they cannot achieve a perfect matrix organization where you have your verticals defined by different disciplines and your horizontals, which are your product teams. Sometimes organizations can get confused when they have such multiple reporting lines and they just put it all in one bucket and they call it a day. It doesn't need to be that way. As long as the product and technology are coherent and they always work in tandem.
Hi Vlad, we've got a couple of questions on this topic. Chris Arnold's asked, regarding building teams, do you lean towards defining them yourself or allowing more autonomy so they can self-organize into different teams as required?
I would turn towards the latter, and this has to do with so let me take a step back. I think, especially in the context of scaling up an engineering and product function, scaling up quickly and preserving the culture and ethos tend to pull in opposite directions. So my preferred approach to that has been to seed new teams with people from the existing ones, and that giving them the autonomy to decide that structure further on. Effectively comes down to, we've built a baby together, we've made a baby, now you're absolutely mature enough to make your own baby, and why wouldn't you have the freedom to do that how you best see fit, if you're in that position to be the seed of such a new team? And obviously across the family of products, they would have commonality because they're part of the same family, but they would also have differences. So maybe in one team you need more of this, a little bit less of that. You can't be too prescriptive, I think.
Okay, thank you. Martin's asked, what does T-shaped mean to you in the context of an engineering team as opposed to a product team?
I can tell you what it means for the roles for the types of products that I've built. A lot of my career has been very back-end heavy. A lot of low-level, systems level development in C, C#, C++, Go, Rust. And having someone who's, having a whole team that is good at systems level engineering and having at least an appreciation for how networks work and at least an appreciation for how database systems and queues work would be fantastic. And then if you have anyone who knows more than everyone else on the team about each specific area, then they can be the thought leader for that class of problems. So imagine it as a Venn diagram where you have several sets intersecting at the intersection of that set. Of those sets, you have those common skills and knowledge, and everyone has branched out in a slightly different direction, but they all contribute with that extra bit to the well-being and the knowledge base of that team.
Perfect. And
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, last question before we move on to the next slide. Livia has asked, how do you assemble teams when you deal with both internal full-time employees, vendors, and contractors?
Oh, that's a good one. Because with 101 Ways, that's exactly what we do. We set up hybrid teams specifically for that reason, to bring that skill diversity and maybe some new ideas into existing teams, and sharing that knowledge with them. I would say it's all the same. So it's based on skill, on drive, and motivation, rather than, so those are the lines of demarcation, rather than is this person a perm or is this person a contractor. The people need to be the right blend, no matter what, whose payroll they're on. Was there another question before the next slide?
No, sorry, that's that's it. Let's move on to the next slide.
Okay. Big pet peeve of mine about product trial and onboarding. I myself have been in companies that developed passes and SaaSes, where if you wanted to give them a try, you had to get in touch with sales first. That was your first calling for it, which makes for a fairly tedious process where you have the whole sales function involved ahead of any kind of technical validation. Some of the products that I've built that have been successful, we've tried to turn that upside down and make the engineer to engineer communication bridge be the first port of call. And we've done that through, for instance, we built some passes. They had APIs. That was the only interface to the product. So we made those available right away. You could just sign up with whatever email address, you'd get access to a developer portal. And you could try out the API, and that was a real API, not just a mock. So you could experiment and see how it fits into your own world. You could do that either through the same one production platform, or you could do that on something you spin up separately. If you have a CI/CD pipeline, you can always spin up pristine environments on demand and shut them down to give people that flexibility. Failing that, having at least a developer feedback form next to the sales form. Some people might have questions they would want to ask you. They can just get in touch. Obviously, you would have some noise, but I think in the end, especially if you're building a new product, that helps give you that extra feedback that you would only get several months later after all of the sales cycle has ended. The other important thing I think is to create besides that self-service portal, to implement usage reporting and analytics both for your company and for the customer as early as possible. Obviously, the temptation would be to develop the core of your platform and do all of the other bits at a later time. What I found is that if you do that, your core team will almost always have to spend some time assisting some other part of the organization with onboarding new customers and providing on-the-spot stats, which all takes time. I think the investment in building that as early as possible pays off in the long run. So that was that for this. Wonder if anyone has any thoughts.
Any questions on this one from anyone? I can't see anything at the moment.
Okay, we're gonna skip to the next one, which ties deeply into the previous point about product and engineering. If you have built a team of missionaries who are proud of what they build, and if the product audience is other people who are also engineers, then I think your own team is probably the best evangelist for that. And for that, to get benefit from that, the company needs to attend the right events. Not too long ago, I was working for a company that attended this massive yearly conference where I believe 3,000 other companies were present, all in the same space. And the people representing those companies were mostly sales. So obviously they'll competed for the attention span of a very saturated audience, if you will. The opposite of that is having your engineering and product people attend events where other engineering and product people are, and ideally where you're the only company in your space, where you're the only one offering your type of product. It's all about show and tell. On top of that, having an engineering blog is also useful, I find. We all suffer from the imposter syndrome to some degree. What seems obvious to us, we think of it as just too obvious. Why would we tell the world about it? Well, sometimes people have thought about the same thing and they haven't come to a solution, or they've come to a different one, as we are doing now. And either they present you with a new way of thinking, or you do that for them, or you simply provide the validation. And the simple fact that they see things are happening, and engineering as a discipline thrives in your company, they'd be a lot more confident in choosing your product because they know the sort of dedication that goes into building it. In terms of advocacy, once we have been to these events and we've told everyone about our product, it's time to collect feedback from prospective and existing customers. traditional companies have had sales engineers, but even they came in very different shapes and sizes. Some of them were mostly sales, some of them were actual engineers. The whole point is having this outer layer around your core engineering team that collect customer feedback, maintain the developer tooling, and manage the developer communities. If you can develop an open source community around your platform, that would be fantastic, because you get all of these ideas all in one place, feature requests. Some people might need a feature so badly that they would go ahead and implement it themselves. Obviously, if it fits your level of quality and if it fits your roadmap, then why wouldn't you accept a pull request, for instance? But I think the biggest thing that doing this gets you is shaping your product in near real time. Most traditional companies have maybe once a year or once a quarter roadmap meeting where they start from very unprovable theories about what would make a product successful, and they chart that 3-month or that year period and say, here's a list of outputs we need. So you're effectively only agile in the very last portion of that cycle, where you do build the thing right, but you don't really know if you're building the right thing. So having this engagement, constant engagement with the community buys you that. I think that was it for this section.
Yeah, again, I think everyone agrees with you, and unless anyone's got any questions.
Okay.
No, I don't think so. Yeah,
okay.
Let's move on to the last slide.
I'll switch to, so this is my last slide. It has to do with bespoke work, and this is a very tricky topic, especially for young companies that maybe have a handful of customers and a very short runway. Sometimes you don't really have a choice, and you have to build something fairly specific for the customer. But if you must do that, I would advise building it not inside the core platform, but at the edge through some integration layer. Use an integration platform, an API gateway, use Lambdas, any way you can to not push that very customer specific code into your platform. Besides the obvious drawbacks of doing that, as you evolve the platform, you have to carry that weight along with you. If you're looking for your next round of investment, and I'm putting my due diligence hat on, that's going to be the very first thing that is flagged by the due diligence consultant to the investor, that as a vulnerability, that over-reliance on one customer or a handful of customers. So simply put, if you can extract it into an integration layer, fine. Have a strong API sunsetting schedule. Only commit to support APIs for a reasonable amount of time. Obviously, the younger the company is, the shorter that time frame would be. And also could offer financial rewards to customers who are willing to throw away the custom functionality and move to the nearest API platform, either through generous pricing models or well, that plus the sunsetting schedule, I suppose. How are we doing for time? I think we went through this really quickly.
Yeah, I think we've got 10 minutes left. So if anyone has any questions about any of the slides they want to jump back to, or just anything in particular you want to ask Vlad, feel free to chime in. Oh, I think we've got a question from Martin. One question on the previous slide and a comment about only being agile at the end of the process. Any best practices on how to balance testing, validating that what you're building early with releasing unfinished low quality features?
think it comes down to really understanding what the minimum viable, I won't call it a product, but the minimum viable feature for a customer to try out. If your entire CI/CD environment is set up optimally, I could imagine a scenario where you give someone access to a sort of a canary deployment where they only have that feature turned on for their account. They try it out and they reach their conclusions, you reach your own before you commit to developing something more sophisticated for them. I've also worked with companies that had feature requests come into a sort of a priority heap. In other words, the more customers that requested the same feature, the higher the priority of that feature became. So that's a model that could work.
Does anyone else have any questions?
And that's probably the best I've seen and done, short of letting it go back to the old times when the loudest stakeholder won the conversation in the boardroom for the whole year.
Sorry, John Stevenson's just asked, are there any off-the-shelf products you use for getting user feedback?
Can't think of any really. It's mostly been through direct engagement with the developer advocates and often product managers. Sometimes it could be a simple conversation or something that came through that developer feedback form, and that was then refined into better user stories in the next cycles. I'm sorry, I can't think of an actual tool that does that in an elegant way, but that's actually a good point. I'll do some research on that.
He says, no problem, thanks. Any other questions from anyone?
I can ask a question. Sorry, I was just typing it in. I just want to ask you if you're building a organization from start. I mean, you've been appointed the CTO, and there's, you're just starting to build the organization. What would you do in your first month? I know it's a very broad question, but I'll ask you, what are the first things that you would do in a month's time?
I can give you an example to that. When I joined my last permanent role with a company called Globalsign, my remit was to rebuild it completely from a technology and product point of view, and they had lots of products that had come into the fold through M&As. There was a lot of functionality duplication, even though the technology stacks were not the same. I was trying to understand the product roadmap, but my first month was spent trying to understand the business and product strategies to try and determine how large the intersection of those products was before I could move to determining what the best technology stack to serve that would have been. So that was the order. Seeing where the product line came from, where it could go, the markets that it was supposed to serve. This was a digital identity company with some very tight performance requirements, and that a lot of things hinged on that, including where we deployed our services from which geographic region. So long conversation about data centers and whatnot. And yeah, so just understanding the business and product. And then with that, I'll tell you, it took quite a bit more than 1 month. It took almost my entire probation period at the end of which my performance was judged based on the questions I had asked rather than the answers I'd come up with. And as soon as I felt comfortable that I knew enough, obviously not everything, I transitioned to finding the best technology stack, which obviously starts from functional, non-functional requirements, looking at the available talent in different regions. We ended up in London because it was halfway between the US and Japan, where we already had engineering teams. We chose to use Go because it was a good intersection of skills from talent pools that we had access to, and so on. If I had to do it again, I would probably take a similar path.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
A question from Martin, related to a previous question, I believe. What metrics do you use to decide to optimize for speed or quality?
Technical debt. And obviously, that's a very fine line you need to walk. If you're a young company, you'll be extremely tempted to pile up technical debt, to make that impact, to give that good impression, or secure that funding.
Perfect.
It's entirely subjective determination. Obviously, the larger the company, the more generous the safety net. Having that would make me more likely to err on the side of quality, of course. If you can assess the technical debt and if you have a very, very specific slot where you address that in your near future, then I would be comfortable with that. But if it's just parked under the rug, we'll do it later at some point, whenever, if ever, then no, I would not encourage that.
Perfect. Livy's asked, as a practice, are you aware of any process and tools, blueprints to be used to set up new projects, shops or teams?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
I'm sorry, let me qualify a little bit. So for instance, when you're starting a team and you've talked about that, and you may have various vendors and other companies involved, or you just hire a lot of people all together, or when you already have the team, but then you start a project. Of course, you didn't hire that team for no good reason, so you must have a project to start as well. And that involves, interacting with the client, all the kind of typical project management tools, but also the processes in place for, the continuous integration and whatnot from technical perspective as a process and everything. And it's sometimes a struggle for larger companies as well to get two projects off the ground in very similar fashion. And I was wondering whether you're aware of any kind of packaged, blueprints, documentation, or templates, if you will, for such approach. Or, obviously there's no template for a process, it's just a description of process, but you get it.
I don't have a simple answer to that, but going back to a previous question about how I tackle existing teams and products, I would say most of my time initially would then goes towards knowing the people, because I do prefer people over processes. That's just my own opinion. So if you can understand the capabilities of the team, I believe finding the best way to convey a concept, a technical concept, is, could pretty much use any tool that the team deems suitable for getting a point across. I personally have no preference. The quality of what you put in the tool is more important than the tool. I've seen very bad tools being used by people who could communicate very clearly in general, and things just worked out.
All right, thanks.
Great, thanks, Vlad. I think we've just about run out of time now. But yeah, unless anyone's got any other questions they want to throw in quickly at the end, I can't see anything on the chat. No. Okay, great. Well, yeah, like I say, thanks, Vlad. Great chat. Really insightful. Feel free to reach out to Vlad on LinkedIn or myself if you've got any other questions. But yeah, until next time, we'll yeah, stay safe. I'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Right.
Thanks a lot.